brothers and sisters. This is Dr. William Schnoebelen coming to you from With One Accord Ministries with a combination warning but also a Treasure Guardians video. And we're just going to talk a little bit about Hanukkah, which is coming up in a few days as we're filming this. But, you know, we go into fairly great detail in an earlier video. In fact, one of the first videos we ever did was on Hanukkah. So you can search that out on our YouTube channel. We'll probably provide a link below. But I want to apply Hanukkah today in a special way because of the crisis we are facing right now, both in our nation and in the churches too. Briefly, just to, you know, if you're not familiar with the whole Hanukkah story, back in the couple of centuries before Moshiach, Yahushua, Jesus, the Greeks came in and conquered Jerusalem. The king of that time was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was brutal. And he did all sorts of wicked stuff to the Jewish people, and he forced them to become secular. He forbade circumcision, he forbade Torah study, and he forbade, you know, going to synagogues to worship on the Shabbat, Sabbath. And just basically, he was actually running around burning Torah scrolls if he could find them. This guy was really Antichrist, even before Yahushua walked the earth, that kind of spirit. Well, anyhow, what happened was many Jews co-opted. They compromised. They were, we'll just become Greeks. And again, there's nothing wrong with being Greek per se, you know, Yah forbid. But in this case, the Greco-Persian Empire had set itself up against the Almighty King of the universe and his Torah. So, a lot of the Jews compromised, and they became totally secularized because they were afraid. But one family stood up, a priestly family that came to be known as the Maccabees, and they fought back against this. And by a miracle, they were able to rally an army, which by the power of Elohim, they were able to defeat this big army under the command of this Antiochus guy. And it's just a miracle in and of itself. But in the meantime, these family members, some of them, the Maccabees family, were tortured, and rather than disobey the Torah, they chose to be tortured and killed in quite a horrible way, which I won't go into. They were martyred for the sake of the name of the Almighty and for the sake of His Word. And yet, because of that, ultimately, the Antiochus armies were defeated, the temple was reclaimed, and among other things, I forgot to mention one thing. One of the worst things this guy did was he took a pig and sacrificed it on the holy altar of the temple, having first set up a statue to the Greek god Zeus. I mean, what blasphemy. So anyhow, so they had to rededicate the temple, and that the word rededicate or dedication of the temple is Hanukkah in Hebrew. So that's where this whole thing comes from. And I'm not going to get into the rest of it because I want to try and keep this short. But here's the deal. These people were courageous enough to fight against the forces of secularism, to fight against the forces of paganism. Because in those days, the Greeks and the early Roman people were all pagans. They all worshiped false Elohim. And the Jewish people were a sole light of truth in those days. So, we have a similar situation going on today in our churches. And I think a lot of you know what I mean. I mean, secular and pagan ideas are flooding into the churches. We've talked about this in several videos. We have a DVD we did several years ago called Churchcraft, which is a really powerful teaching. It goes into depth on this. But just to point that out. Also, in some states, these restrictions that have been placed on us because of this COVID virus have caused churches to be shut down, forbidden to worship, even though bars and strip clubs are allowed to be open. Isn't that special, though? Because churches aren't essential, of course, according to these governments, but strip clubs are. I mean, talk about a secular, godless culture. That's just a perfect example. But anyway, and people are being, forced to wear masks, and even though they might well be counterproductive, there's a lot of studies out there that say they just are sort of a placebo. They don't really do anything, and especially if you're healthy, you don't really need them. But it doesn't matter. The government says to do it, so we do it. And we as believers are commanded to come together and worship, and that's in Hebrews 10:25 and several places in Leviticus 23. We are commanded to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, but come together in holy convocations. So essentially, these governments, these secular, this isn't coming from the federal government, mind you, yet. This is coming from various states, most notably California and New York, the two most liberal Democrat country states in the Union, I would imagine. But still, they are literally ordering their people to disobey the commandments of Yahushua. And this is positively evil. Okay? Now, courts are beginning to strike these mandates down, which is great. I mean, a combination of Jewish leaders in New York City and also Christians, Catholics, whatever, they all been together and filed a suit. And I believe that they are being forced to, I forget the name of the bonehead that's the mayor of New York. I think it's, is it de Blasio? Anyway, I don't know. I can't keep track of it all. I have trouble keeping track of my own state. But anyway, the point is, some of these things are because they're unconstitutional. You can't interfere with people's right to freedom of worship, First Amendment, and also their right to assemble peaceably, freedom of worship. That's both in the First Amendment of our Constitution, aside from being in the Bible, which is far more important than the Constitution. So anyway, realize that the vast majority of churches just went along with this, like sheep. I mean, and yeah, I know the media has been flooding us with doom porn about how the whole world is going to be wiped out by this COVID vaccine, which is basically nonsense. It's medical nonsense. I've talked about this in another video, and even we have a DVD called Bulletproofing Your Immune System that deals in depth with that, so I don't want to get into it, except just to say that, it's barely more dangerous than the flu. And yeah, the flu is bad. The people, especially elderly and infirm people, die from the flu every year, but it's not a reason to shut down the entire country. So anyway, the point is, down the pike, we have coming this vaccine. And that's a whole nother evil, thing, because as you probably know, our ministry stands against vaccines. I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I understand how these things work. They are very injurious to the immune system, especially to be given to babies or young children, but really anybody. I mean, I have not had any kind of vaccine. In fact, the last time I had a flu shot was in 1995, and I got the flu. I stopped doing that, because I'm, first you don't succeed, stop it. And since then, I have never had the flu. And that's been 25 years. So anyhow, the trick is to fortify your immune system. Instead of injecting evil foreign stuff that, has everything from monkey viruses to aborted fetal tissue and mercury and all kinds of evil things in it, just don't. It's not kosher. It's not scriptural. And it's not even that effective. So, end of my little mini sermon on vaccines. But why do most churches go along with this stuff? I'll tell you in about 4 words. Romans 13, 1 through 7. And, they don't understand what Paul is talking about here. I'm just going to read this, especially the first couple verses. Romans 13, 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of Elohim, for powers that be are ordained of Elohim. For whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of Elohim. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt receive the praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee which is good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Now, in the last, I don't know how many years, as long as I've been alive, churches have interpreted that to mean the civil government, that we are supposed to kowtow to the civil authorities. That's not what that means. Realize that Paul was writing that in the days of Roman persecution. He would, the church was being brutalized. I mean, the Roman government was basically run by a madman. I don't know the exact dates, but people like Caligula and other people who thought they were gods. They thought they were, literally gods, and that people were required to worship the Roman emperor as gods. You probably know all this. But the point is, why would Paul tell us to obey such a totally evil entity? Of course he wouldn't. What people fail to understand is, during the time that this epistle was written, there were ecclesiastical authorities in the Israelite nation. The Levites were in charge of protecting the tabernacle. They carried swords. Just people see that, that word sword, that must be the federal government or the state government. No, it isn't. There was literally an elite cadre of Levites that were trained to protect the tabernacle, that were trained to protect people from going beyond where they should go, depending on whether they were a Cohen or whether they were a lay Israelite. I hate that word, but you know what I mean. And that was what it was. I mean, and also to execute judgment, just like it says in this verse, because there are in the Torah commandments that have the death penalty. And these were the people that were authorized to do that. And there was judges, there were courts, and Deuteronomy 17 taught. All this is in the Torah. I don't want to go into a lot of depth on it, but just to understand it, when Paul is talking about these rulers, these authorities, these ministers of Elohim, they are literally Levite authorities under the Kohanim and under the great Sanhedrin. And at that time, it was more corrupt because, it had been infiltrated, and that's a whole nother teaching. But, still, it's there. And that's what you're supposed to obey. Ecclesiastical authorities, if the civil government gets out of line, then, we don't have to obey it. And, the apostles said in Acts 5, they said we ought to obey Elohim rather than men. And that's what we've got to go by, not what some preacher is thinking it means, because that's not what it means. Okay, now, here's the thing. What are we learning by all of this? Well, we see that most people in America and most churches are just going along with this. And I already kind of talked about the whole COVID thing. It's not the big bugaboo that people think it is. But, and I don't want to get into a whole thing about that because they'll probably censor this video if I do. But I want to get the word out on the larger issue. Whether or not the COVID virus is dangerous, it is to certain people. But for most people, it has like a 99% recovery rate. I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, that means you have a 1% chance of dying from COVID unless you're either infirm or have a bunch of comorbid diseases, or, of course, if you're very elderly. So here's the problem. What do you do when the vaccine comes out? If these people are willing to let everybody tell them to wear masks that are not really needed, what are they going to do when this vaccine comes out and there's all this? Hopefully it will just be social pressure. But what if it's more than that? What if it's, okay, colleague of mine, a brother of mine, Shannon Davis, is concerned. We talked about this on the Omega Man show, because where he lives, the government is saying, not in America, that if you want to, fly, or if you want to travel anywhere, you have to have a certification, you have a COVID test, which is basically nonsense because, frankly, I just saw an article the other day that they did blood work on blood in a blood bank from 2019. It was, over a year and a half old, and it had COVID viruses in it, which is crazy because there was no COVID virus in America until early 2020. Why did that happen? Because let me tell you, this is the truth. Virtually every person who's ever had a flu shot has something that's going to set off the COVID test. It's going to give you a false positive. And of course, huge numbers of Americans have been deceived enough to have a flu shot. So anyhow, the point is that, we can't just always go along with these things. We got to pray about it. We got to seek counsel together, pray together, and see what the scriptures teach. So here's the thing. Down through the years, up until really the last century, there are all sorts of examples of preachers, Bible-believing preachers, that stood against the government. There's what was called the Black-Robed Regiment during the period of the beginning of the Revolutionary War, where preachers in Protestant churches, because most of the churches in that day in American colonies were Protestant, would stand up against the British government, and they would literally have muskets beside themselves in their pulpits, and they'd preach a sermon, they'd rally the troops, so to speak, and then they would grab their muskets, and all the men would go out of the church and go fight the British. And we need preachers like that today, not necessarily to go out and fight, but to at least fight spiritually and to preach the truth. Okay. Also, later on in the 19th century, the whole slavery thing, which was still operating in England and in America, was basically overturned by people like William Wilberforce and others, great statesmen who were strong Christians in both America. Wilberforce was English, and England went first and got rid of slavery, and then America followed because of the influence of Christian ministers. That's the main reason. So the question then becomes that we have a duty as Christians to disobey tyrannical edicts if they force us to go against the gospel, to go against our own good health. If you're like in a family, or if you're a father or a mother of your children, you have the right to make those determinations about your family, not some faceless bureaucrat hiding behind a face diaper. Okay, so why are the governments doing these things? Well, possibly to throw an election. We're seeing that play out right now as we're filming this in early December of 2020. Also, to get us used to obeying silly rules for our own good. Also, because to scare us half to death and to prepare the way for vaccines. And finally, possibly to prepare us down the road for the mark of the beast. And I would just parenthetically say this. I did some videos for the Prophecy Club way back in the early 2000s. Honestly, I couldn't tell you which one they were in offhand because it's been almost 20 years, but where I talked about the fact that I was told when I was in Satanism and in the Illuminati, because I was a member of the Illuminati, first level, that the way they would bring in the mark of the beast, that was the plan, was through a vaccine. It wasn't going to be through some dumb microchip. It was going to be a vaccine. Now, that was way back. I was told that in the late 70s. So that was like half a century ago. And that's why I do not want vaccines. I don't want my family to have vaccines. And it's obviously the case. So aside from the health issues, which are manifold, especially for children. So anyway, they're trying to get us ready for that. So this is a battle between light and darkness. It really is. Churches, understand this, churches used to be blazing lights. They would just shine out like beacons in the night. And I remember when I was starting to come out of Satanism, if I would try to go into Bible-believing church, the power, the light that came out from that church, I couldn't even get in the door hardly until I finally got saved. It was terrifying to me. It was like standing in the winds of a hurricane, the power that was coming out of that church. You can't find that very much anymore. And that's unfortunate, because where does that power come from? It comes from the preaching of the word. It comes from set apart worship, and it comes from a fear of Elohim. And the trouble is, today, things have conspired to quench that light. And this is totally evil. Because we have insipid sermons, we have, self-centered worship directed toward making us feel good rather than worshiping the Almighty. We have lawless teaching and a lack of reverence, a lack of the fear of Elohim. And because of that, the light is dimming. The light is dimming. And a large number of churches have stopped doing true worship, true preaching, and as a result, when you go to those churches, they are offering pigs on the altar. In some cases, literally. I mean, I've preached at churches, and these were good, solid, fundamentalist churches where they would have, ham and cheese sandwiches after the thing, or they'd have a breakfast, to raise money for something or other, and it would be sausage and eggs, and that's against the scriptures. You're eating pig. You're putting the pig on the altar of your own body, which is, if you're a believer, it's a temple of the Ruach HaKodesh. One of these days I'm going to do a whole thing on that, but I haven't had the time. Too much craziness going on in the world. Anyway, so literally they're offering pigs on the altar, but additionally, spiritually, very little Elohim. Probably very little of Elohim for that matter. Very little fear of, you never hear that preached. That's pigs. I mean, you got concerts being given instead of worship that are intended to tickle the ear, make the emotions, rise up. And, it's stagecraft. That's pigs on the altar. You've got little idea of holiness. I mean, that's hardly ever preached. I know I've been to huge things where I was speaking, where they'd have this, and people would be up there dancing around women wearing skin-tight jeans, clothing that left nothing to the imagination, just gyrating around. You'd think it was, and these were leaders. And you'd think it was like you were in a disco or something. That's dating myself, into a club at night, people running around and lights flashing. I mean, it was pigs on the altar. I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about spiritually. But just think of how this is displeasing to the Almighty. The fear of preaching righteousness because of offending snowflakes. People are so afraid to speak against, transgenders or abortion or any of this stuff because they don't want to offend anybody. Well, hey, the preaching of the cross is an offense. Sorry. And they got it, and again, more pigs on the altar. So, many of these pastors have more fear of the culture than they do of Elohim, and that is pathetic. They are panty-waist pastors with no guts. And they're going to be held accountable for that because they're responsible to feed their flock, and they're not doing it. So, the greatest thing that strengthens the light of your church is the fear of Elohim. The greatest thing that strengthens your light, because Yahushua told every single believer, you are a light unto the world. And that's what, among other things, the love you show towards other people is certainly another thing that generates light, if you will. But also the fear of Elohim is a great source of light. Because, there are, you might say, I'm making too big a deal out of it. Well, when I was in England ministering, almost 20 years ago now, we went to there's this monument to the martyrs in the city of Exeter. And they were burned at the stake because they refused to say that the cookie in the Roman Catholic Eucharist was really Jesus. They were burned at the stake for that. The Almighty cares about these things. And these men, and I'm sure women too, were willing to offer up their lives as a testimony for Yahushua HaMashiach and for his word. And we need that kind of spirit today. I pray with all my heart that we never have to come to that in this country. But if we do, what are you going to do? Just asking the question. In parts of our nation, because the light of the churches is dimmed, in some places, most notably on the two coasts, it's all but been quenched, except for little tiny pinpricks of light here and there. And, because of that, we live now as believers in a paganized nation, just like the Maccabees did, just like the Jewish people of that time did. And we have many of us have chosen to offer pigs on the altar rather than incur the wrath of either the social culture or these various civic governments that are trying to go like this and crush the churches under their feet. It just won't do. And, in these times, and I'll close with this because this is getting longer than I thought it would, we need to be serious, prayerful, and careful about what decisions we make. Mind you, there are supposedly millions of believers in this country, if not, supposedly hundreds of millions of believers. And yet, most of them are being led by spineless pastors that aren't willing to fight for the truth or don't even believe the truth themselves. In many cases, a lot of these more liberal pastors, they don't even believe this book. They think this book is a bunch of nice stories and fairy tales and whatever. And that again is on them. It's not the fault of the people in the pulpit. We need to pray for a discernment in these times. We need to pray that righteousness would be restored to our government and that righteousness would be restored to our churches. Because let me tell you, it's a great spiritual truth that the government of a nation can never rise higher than the churches that are in that nation. And if the churches that are becoming corrupt, and I know the government is just pathetic. It's so corrupt. You need to take a steam shovel and just throw the whole bunch in Congress out except for a handful of them. But the point is, we need to pray for discernment about how to move in these times, about how our churches need to move in these times, how we need to respond to these things, and also we need to pray for a true leading of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, in case our pastors are not willing to step up to the plate. Because let me tell you, brothers and sisters, there is a lot on the line. Because frankly, at least in the West, America is the last bastion of some sort of Christianity. And we need to hold on to that and make that light bright again by our work, by our prayer, by our reverence for the Almighty, and again, by doing good works, by helping others, by doing charitable things and so on. That's all good too. Anyway, I hope this has been a blessing to you, and I want to end with a prayer, but I want to just say that these are difficult times. We thank you for your prayers because we're really getting slammed spiritually, and of course we're coming up on another satanic holiday in a couple of weeks with the solstice. Thank you for your support. Anything you can do to help us would be greatly appreciated during these seasons because we're feeling the pinch just like everybody else is. And we thank you for what you are doing, and we thank you for your prayers. And I just want to pray for now the people that are here listening to this. Father, I just pray in Yahushua's mighty name that this would not be in any way, this message would not make people feel like they're under condemnation or even seem like an attack upon certain church leaders. But Father, there's a lot of idle shepherds out there. And we just need to have a true leading of the Ruach as the body of Messiah in this country and indeed in the whole world. Father, we need your truth. We need your boldness. We need your courage. We need the Ruach HaKodesh like never before to be with us, to be with our pastors, our elders, our deacons, and so on. Please, Father, have mercy on us. Please, Father, just fill us with your Ruach HaKodesh, clothe us with your supernatural power, and help us to see clearly. Open the eyes of our understanding, Father. open our ears clearly to hear your word and to be able to crack open your Bible, your scripture, and to read those words and have them come alive for us and come becoming deep in our hearts, deep in our spirits, and to give us strength and direction for how we're to proceed in the days to come. Because these are going to be trying times no matter what happens. We know that. And we thank you for your support, Father. We thank you for your Ruach HaKodesh. We thank you for the power of the cross and the blood and the stripes of Yahushua Mashiach. And we cling to him. We cling to the cross, and we ask you for your guidance every step of the way as we walk through our lives. In Yahushua's mighty name, Amen, V'imru, Amen. Thank you, brothers and sisters. May you be richly blessed. Shalom, shalom.